Welcome back, everybody. Well, we have made it. It's the final episode of Napoleon's Marshals. This is part 6. If you haven't seen the first 5 parts of my reaction to this fantastic series from Epic History, the link is in the description to take you back to the beginning. The link's there for the original content. Cannot recommend Epic History to you enough. One of the best content creators out there, especially when it comes to things like the Napoleonic Wars. With that in mind, I want to thank Mitchell Furr for your support on Patreon. Mitchell, I've seen you a lot in the live streams in the chat lately, and someday we got to figure out how we're related, because I'm sure we're related. Furs run deep in my family. So with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into the 6th and final part of this series. I'll be really curious to hear about these top 3, because a lot of you were saying you felt like of the ones that we've talked about so far, maybe Suchet was the best of all of them. And I'm inclined to agree that of the ones we've heard about, he seems to have had the best performance record. So it'll be interesting to see how Berthier, Lannes, and Davout stack up against that.
3. Marshal Berthier.
No one else could replace him. He was Napoleon's chief of staff, so...
Louis-Alexandre Berthier was born at Versailles, 10 miles from Paris. His mother served at the palace as a chambermaid to the future Louis XVIII. His father was a colonel in the Topographical Engineers, a specialist corps of military surveyors. Berthier followed in his father's footsteps, joining the Topographical Engineers aged just 13.
So he's quite a bit older than Napoleon. What, about 15, 16 years older than Napoleon? He's number 1 in seniority. Unlike a lot of these guys who come from like more lower or middle class that we would call today backgrounds, this guy's got a nobility background. I mean, if your family is that close that you're rubbing shoulders with and caring for a member of the royal family, like the younger brother of the guy who actually becomes king, Louis XVIII, he's the younger brother of Louis XVI.
Was commissioned lieutenant at 17. He proved a talented and diligent staff officer. 10 years later, he accompanied General Rochambeau to America as part of French support to the colonists in their War of Independence, and witnessed the British defeat at Yorktown.
Yeah, Rochambeau is in command of the French troops in the last stages of the War of Independence. He's there at Yorktown leading the French army. Yorktown was a combined American-French effort. It was the French fleet that was blocking the British by sea. It was a combined French and American army that was laying siege on landside.
By the time the French Revolutionary Wars broke out, Berthier was a brigadier general with 25 years' service, who'd studied and given much thought to the problems of military organization and command.
Big difference between a lot of these other guys who are sergeants, privates, lower-ranking officers when the Revolutionary Wars break out. This guy's a general already.
A reputation for outstanding staff work meant his services were in high demand, and he served as Chief of Staff to Rochambeau, Lafayette, and Luckner. But during the Terror, ties to these politically suspect generals put Berthier himself under the spotlight. And
Lafayette, the only reason that he himself was not sent to the guillotine was because of his service as an American general in the American War for Independence. Unlike guys like Rochambeau, Rochambeau was a French general leading French troops. Lafayette's commission was actually in the American army as a major general. So he was an American general, even though he was French, and he's like 21, 22 years old. But I've mentioned this before, his wife's sister, mother, and grandmother were all sent to the guillotine, and that's why Lafayette and his wife are buried in Picpus Cemetery in France. They're literally buried right next to the mass grave. I mean, within feet of the mass grave of over 1,000 guillotine victims, because of that close connection to family members. And it was because of the PR disaster that it would have been to imprison and execute an American hero like Lafayette that he wasn't sent to the guillotine.
He was stripped of his rank and not officially reinstated until 1795, when he became Chief of Staff of the Army of Italy. A Chief of Staff led the staff section, which was responsible for turning the general's orders into action by drafting written instructions which were sent out by courier, as well as every aspect of army administration.
I love that they're showing what the job of the Chief of Staff was. We've talked a little bit about Chief of Staff roles already in previous episodes, but it's going to vary depending on what army you're in and what time period you're in, but it cannot be stressed enough. Chief of Staff sounds like a glorified secretary, and they even joke about that in the musical Hamilton, about Hamilton not wanting to be Washington's secretary, but this is so much more than that. This is a vital right-hand man, literally, to the general, and very often exercises the authority of the commanding general.
Ensuring efficient movement and supply, and collating reports on the enemy, terrain, roads, and anything else that might affect operations. Berthier, building on recent trends in French staff practice, now developed his own comprehensive staff organization. He established 3 sections. His personal office or cabinet, mostly skilled civilian clerks who handled troop movements, transcribed orders, filed reports, and collated intelligence on enemy forces. His private military staff, made up of aides-de-camp, liaison officers and couriers. And the general staff itself, headed by the First Assistant Major General, also divided into 3 sections.
So you're a Major General and you are the Chief of Staff to the Chief of Staff. That shows you how important this rank is. And I think sometimes we don't take enough time to dig into the logistical challenges of operating these huge armies in these campaigns. It is massive undertaking, and it requires somebody with a heavy degree of skill when it comes to organization. That says a lot about who Berthier is.
The first dealt with additional troop movements, plus auxiliary services such as hospitals, military policing, prisoners of war, and security of supply lines.
Don't underestimate this level of organization having a significant impact on the success of Napoleon's armies.
The second section organized the army's camps and billets. The third section was the topographical section, responsible for maps and reconnaissance. The general structure of Berthier's system changed little over the next 18 years and proved uniquely effective at handling the challenges posed by a new era of European warfare. Its chief beneficiary would be the Army of Italy's new commander, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon also discovered that his chief of staff possessed immense personal qualities, a heroic capacity for work, meticulous memory and attention to detail, and devotion to duty and discipline.
You have to have that stuff in a role like this, right? I mean, as a chief of staff, you have to be incredibly skilled and intelligent, but also devoted to your duty and not really concerned about personal glory, because you're not going to get a great deal of that in a role like that.
Crucially, he had a gift for turning Napoleon's verbal, sometimes vague, commandments into clear, concise written orders that made sense to his officers and later marshals. Napoleon and Berthier established a highly effective working relationship that would last until 1814. It relied on Berthier's complete acceptance of his subordinate role. He played no part in devising strategy and never challenged or contradicted Napoleon except on points of logistical detail. When a friend queried his devotion to Napoleon, who was an extremely demanding and short-tempered boss, Berthier replied, "Remember that one day it will be a fine thing to be second to Bonaparte."
Yep.
Berthier's hard work and brilliant staff system underpinned all Napoleon's successes in Italy and beyond. They spent so much time together, Berthier was nicknamed Napoleon's wife. He was personally brave too, leading an attack at Lodi and a cavalry charge at Rivoli.
So I've talked some about how often this staff officer role, this chief of staff role, is filled by like a young up and coming officer, but obviously this runs very counter to that. But you would often still have other guys. Your chief of staff is one of several staff officers. And I think of guys like George Washington, who not only has Alexander Hamilton, who serves as kind of his de facto chief of staff, but he's also got guys on his staff like John Lawrence, who's another young guy but brilliant. And Lawrence is actually going to be given the role of writing up the Articles of Surrender at Yorktown. He wasn't in South Carolina redefining bravery the way they say in Hamilton. But the fact that this guy filled this role, he's older than Napoleon, and he fills it for so long, says a lot about the degree of competency.
But his genius was for staff work and administration, not army command, as he well knew. When he briefly inherited command of the Army of Italy in 1797, he begged Napoleon to return as soon as possible to take over. Berthier played a crucial role in planning Napoleon's Egyptian expedition of 1798, and masterminded his famous crossing of the Alps in 1800, which saw French troops advance almost 100 miles through the mountains in just 8 days. The same year, Napoleon made Berthier Minister of War, putting him in charge of all French military administration. When Napoleon proclaimed his new empire in 1804, Berthier was the first name on the list of new marshals, with seniority over all others.
Says a lot.
The next year, his role as Chief of Staff, or Major Général of the Grande Armée, was officially confirmed. In the fast-moving campaign of 1805, Berthier's system ensured Napoleon always had up-to-date information about the location and strength of his own forces, as well as the latest reports on enemy movements, from scouts, spies, and prisoners. Such advantages helped him achieve the stunning encirclement of Mack's Austrian army at Ulm. On campaign, Berthier and the Emperor often travelled together in the imperial coach.
It's fascinating just listening to all of this. All the other marshals we've been talking about so far, we're talking about guys who led a division that was instrumental in a battle, or led a corps who was instrumental in a battle. Now we're talking about a guy who is instrumental for all of it. He's the one who plans the routes that they march across the Alps. He's the one that lays the logistical foundation for movements into places like southern Germany or in Egypt. I know I'm saying it over and over and over again, but we can't say enough about how so many of the most prominent generals we talk about in history had guys like this who made their success possible.
Working without pause. His workload was immense, but so too were the rewards. Following the victory at Austerlitz, Napoleon made Berthier the hereditary sovereign prince of Neuchâtel and Valengian, with an enormous private income.
That's different than a lot of the titles, the Duke titles and the Count titles that he's given to some of these other marshals, which are really just titles. The fact that this one comes with a hereditary title, which means it can be passed down, it comes with land and income. This is much more along the lines of a real sort of prince or dukedom.
Over the course of Napoleon's reign, he received endowments worth more than 1 million francs per year from the emperor, more than any other marshal. Yet Berthier remained a liability as a field commander. In 1809, Napoleon put him in temporary command of the Army of Germany. When Archduke Charles made a bold advance into Bavaria, Berthier's response was hesitant and muddled, and nearly led to Marshal Davout's corps being encircled.
When you're a guy whose entire career during the Napoleonic Wars is as a staff officer working directly with and under Napoleon, and suddenly you're thrown out there occasionally as a commander, it makes sense to me that you're going to be hesitant, that you're in a role you're not familiar with, you're so used to being subservient and taking orders that it's difficult to adapt.
Only Napoleon's arrival averted disaster. Returning to his usual role as Chief of Staff, Berthier once more proved his exceptional talents, coordinating the movement of 200,000 men and paving the way for the Emperor's victory at Wagram. The title Prince of Wagram was added to his honours. The invasion of Russia in 1812 was a test like no other for Marshal Berthier and his staff. It required coordinating the movement of 500,000 troops, the biggest army ever seen in Europe, across a 400-mile front. "A simple private is happier than I," Berthier complained. "I am being killed by all this work."
Not surprised.
By August, it was clear the Grande Armée's supply lines were at breaking point, and Berthier was among those who tried to persuade Napoleon to halt the advance at Smolensk.
The thing about advancing that far is it's not just about marching your army over the terrain. It's that the longer your army is stretched from its base of supply and its friendly territory, the fewer men you have available, because you have to leave men along those lines to protect them. Ulysses S. Grant talks about this in his memoirs, about how when you look on paper and see, oh, the Army of the Potomac has 100,000 men, it doesn't really have 100,000 men available for combat. It has 100,000 men, out of which you have to fight on the battlefield, but also protect your supply lines and cover logistics and deal with the wounded and deal with, your ammunition trains and all these sorts of things. And the longer you get into enemy territory, the longer those lines get stretched out and the fewer men that are there.
He was ignored. As disaster engulfed the army, Berthier continued to perform his duty. By the end of the retreat, he was marching on foot with frostbitten fingers. When Napoleon left the army to return to Paris without him, he wept openly. Despite his own poor health in the wake of the retreat, Berthier worked hard to salvage the remnants of the army, and served throughout the campaign in Germany in 1813. By now, Napoleon's enemies had reformed their own army general staffs, partly inspired by Berthier's example.
This is one of those things that gets talked about sometimes with the Napoleonic Wars, is as you get further and further along in these wars, the more these coalitions go to war with Napoleon, the more they start to adapt to his style. They start operating the way he did. If you can't beat him, join him, right? If what we're doing is not working and what he's doing is, let's be more like him.
But neither Berthier nor his system was perfect. In May, a confusing order to Marshal Ney contributed to his late arrival at the Battle of Bautzen, and a missed chance to crush the coalition army. Berthier was also notorious for his jealousies and grudges. His pedantic vendetta against Jomini, Ney's talented chief of staff, drove him to defect to the Russians. Berthier must also bear some blame for the disastrous end to the Battle of Leipzig. He knew there weren't enough bridges for the army to retreat safely, but failed to press the matter with Napoleon. When the only bridge out of the city was blown too early, 30,000 men became prisoners. Berthier continued to serve Napoleon faithfully through the desperate defense of France until the Emperor's abdication in April 1814. The restored Bourbon monarchy showered titles and honors on Berthier. The king even gave him an honorary rank in his own guard.
This is a guy who had served under the monarchy faithfully. He comes from this minor nobility background. It makes sense to me that he's going to be one of the ones that's lavishly praised by the restored monarchy.
Napoleon's return from exile 11 months later put him in an impossible situation, torn both ways by his sense of duty and loyalty. He accompanied the king on his flight to the Netherlands, but was treated with such suspicion by the royal court that he left for his wife's family estate in Bavaria. There, a few weeks later, Berthier fell from a window and was killed. It was most likely a simple accident, though some believe he killed himself out of guilt or despair, or, less plausibly, was murdered by French royalist agents.
I'm really curious to dig into that story more because, man, certainly the timing is intriguing.
Napoleon had expected Berthier to rejoin him in 1815 and was scathing of his absence. I have been betrayed by Berthier, who was just a gosling, transformed by me into some kind of eagle.
Napoleon, sometimes I feel like he hits it right on the head, and other times I feel like that in his hurt over what he perceives as a betrayal, he can be unfair. And I think this is absolutely unfair. To claim that Napoleon alone made him who he was, no, this guy was incredibly talented, and his talent and service go back long before Napoleon's do.
But after his defeat at Waterloo, in which mismanaged staff work played an important role, Napoleon conceded, if Berthier had been there, I would not have met this misfortune.
Yep.
Berthier had none of Murat's glamour, nor Ney's heroism, nor the tactical instincts of Davout. But he was the indispensable marshal, whose brilliant administration and tireless work were the foundation for so much of Napoleon's military success.
Interesting. So I agree in not putting him number one. Obviously, I think you want somebody who is incredibly talented on the battlefield as well. You know, if you're going to rank the marshals number one, but I can see why he's in the top three, a guy like this.
2. Marshal Lannes.
He had truly become a superior being by the time he perished. I found him a pygmy, but I lost a giant. So, again, high praise, but still Napoleon taking credit for it.
Jean Lannes was a farmer's son from Gascony.
Farmer's son.
Who quit his job as a dyer's apprentice to join the local volunteer battalion in 1792. Energetic and charismatic, he was immediately elected to be an officer by his comrades. The unit was sent to fight the Spanish on the Eastern Pyrenees front, where Lannes proved a brave and active officer. He distinguished himself in several actions and was promoted to command the regiment.
I find myself wondering, has there ever been a major war like this, where so many men, or it's a series of wars, obviously, over like a 20-year span, but where so many men start out as enlisted or not even in the military with no military education background and end up rising to command tens of thousands of troops by the time it's over? Has there ever been so many that have done that? It feels like there haven't been many in history.
Lannes was then transferred to Italy as part of General Augereau's division, where his bold, aggressive leadership won praise from General Massena, and then at Dago from General Bonaparte himself, who rewarded Lannes with command of a grenadier brigade in the army's advance guard. A month later, at the Battle of Lodi, Colonel Lannes was first across the river, leaping off the bridge and wading ashore under enemy fire.
No doubt of his bravery if he's willing to lead like that.
At the Battle of Arcolay, he was wounded twice, but when he heard the French were retreating, he left the dressing station to lead a fresh attack.
And Arcolay is that one where you have the iconic scene that's been repeatedly passed along about Napoleon grabbing the flag, and after the guy was killed next to him, he charges in with the army.
Which probably saved Napoleon from capture or worse. Napoleon later presented the flag he'd waved at the battle to Lannes, and a special bond was formed between them, based on mutual respect and loyalty. Lannes was promoted to Brigadier General, and in 1798 joined Napoleon's expedition to Egypt.
Haven't had many of these guys talked about too much as having been with him in Egypt.
Played a prominent role in the campaign, helping to suppress the revolt in Cairo and leading the assaults on Jaffa and Acre, where he was shot in the neck and only saved from certain death by his men, who carried him back to safety. At the Battle of Abu Qir, Lannes' infantry worked with Murat's cavalry to inflict a crushing defeat on the Ottoman army. While recovering from his latest wounds in this battle, Lannes received painful news from home. His wife had given birth to another man's child.
This happened, I mean, this is when Napoleon is during the campaign in Egypt, and then going up into what we call the Holy Land, that Napoleon finds out that his wife is having an affair.
He returned to France with Napoleon in October and divorced his wife not long after. When Napoleon staged his coup of 18 Brumaire, Lannes helped to ensure the army's loyalty. The next spring, Napoleon's army marched over the Alps into Italy. Lannes' vanguard led the way, and at Montebello encountered an Austrian force that outnumbered it 2-1. Lannes was able to win a brilliant victory thanks to crucial support from General Victor. Just 5 days later, his division played a key role in Napoleon's great victory at Marengo. Lannes never forgot a favour. He and Victor remained firm friends. But he also never forgot a grudge.
I was just thinking, how was he when it came to holding on to grudges if he held on to favors so much?
Notoriously short-fused and quick to perceive an insult. In 1800, Lannes remarried to Louise Antoinette Guernuc, daughter of a senator, with whom he'd have 5 children. He was also appointed commander of Napoleon's consular guard, but he was dismissed after General Berthier helped expose his mismanagement of the budget, for which Lannes never forgave him. In semi-disgrace, Lannes was sent as ambassador to Portugal, a short, eventful spell in which, against expectation, his soldierly manner won over Portugal's Prince Regent. By 1804, it was clear that all was forgiven. Lannes received news that he'd been made a Marshal of the new French Empire, and orders to return to Paris for Napoleon's coronation. The following year, he took command of 5th Corps of the Grande Armée, forming the vanguard for the advance against the Austrian army in Bavaria. Lannes had to work closely with Marshal Murat, a bitter rival since a falling out in Egypt, but they put their differences aside.
So he didn't always hold on to grudges then.
Together, they bluffed an Austrian commander into surrendering a vital Danube bridge by persuading him that an armistice had been signed. At one point, Lannes even snatched the fuse from a soldier's hand as he prepared to light the explosive charges. The day before the Battle of Austerlitz, Lannes' quick temper got the better of him. He demanded to fight a duel with Marshal Soult, who in his eyes had made him look foolish in front of the Emperor. Soult ignored the challenge. In the battle that followed, Lannes' 5th Corps held the left flank against Bagration's attacks, later pushing forward with the cavalry to help take 7,000 Russian prisoners. After the battle, Lannes was infuriated that Soult, and not he, was singled out for praise by the Emperor. Within days, Lannes had resigned his command and returned to France.
Wow.
In 1806, with tempers cooled, Napoleon summoned Lannes to rejoin the army for the war with Prussia. Back in command of 5th Corps, Lannes was as active, aggressive and brilliant as ever. At Saalfeld, he fought the first major combat of the war, routing a Prussian division commanded by Prince Louis Ferdinand. 4 days later, at Jena, Lannes opened the main French attack at dawn, with General Suchet's division in the lead. For 6 hours, his troops were engaged in furious fighting for the villages on the plateau, until finally, the Prussian resistance was broken.
So it makes me wonder, and maybe it has nothing to do with this, but in the aftermath of all the praise going to his rival in a previous battle, going to Soult, I wonder if Lannes was given the honor of leading this attack at Jena to maybe give him an opportunity to get that same kind of praise. Or maybe it just logistically worked out that the 5th Corps was in the lead.
By December, the war had moved into Poland. Lannes attacked a larger Russian force at Pultusk, but it was a bloody, indecisive affair. Wounds and fever then forced him to convalesce in Warsaw, and so missed the Battle of Eylau. That spring, Lannes resumed command of the advance guard as Napoleon sought out Bennigsen's Russian army, hoping to force a decisive battle. When Bennigsen located Lannes' apparently isolated corps near Friedland, he attacked. He expected an easy victory, but Lannes, with support from future Marshals Oudinot and Grouchy, expertly used his troops to fend off the Russians, while Napoleon raced to join him with the main army.
So many times this is the key, is that these corps get spread out, but the whole design of Napoleon's corps system and the way he advances is that wherever contact is made with the enemy, then you hurry to rush and concentrate your forces. And so it's incumbent on that person who's made the contact to be able to hold and get themselves in an advantageous position where they can hold out by themselves against a superior force while the bulk of the army comes up.
Lannes' delaying tactics allowed Napoleon to catch the Russian army with its back to the river and inflict a crushing defeat. The following year, Lannes was ennobled as Duke of Montebello and joined Napoleon for the invasion of Spain, despite suffering a serious riding injury en route. Taking command of Marshal Moncey's Third Corps, Lannes routed a Spanish army at the Battle of Tudela, sending the enemy fleeing in two directions. He was then given command of the siege of Zaragoza. Spanish soldiers and civilians defended the city with legendary courage, but Lannes' leadership and methodical house-by-house approach ensured ultimate victory at a high price. Even Lannes was left shaken by the savagery of the fighting, writing to Napoleon, "Sire, this is a horrifying war."
It's always Spain. Spain, the bane of the existence of Napoleon and his army.
Napoleon recalled Lannes for the war with Austria in 1809. His Provisional Corps formed the vanguard for Napoleon's four-day campaign, a series of quick victories over the Austrians that culminated in the Battle of Egmont. Napoleon next needed Regensburg taken quickly, and so, as usual, he turned to Lannes.
Lannes seems to be out front in a lot of these battles over the last couple of years. That shows a high degree of trust from Napoleon.
After the first assault wave was mown down, Lannes' call for volunteers went unanswered. Furious, he picked up a scaling ladder and shouted, "I'll show you that before I was a marshal, I was a grenadier, and still am."
Nice, I like it. Forward, I like that quote a lot. That's how you inspire your men to do a really difficult task.
His aides grabbed the ladder from him, reorganized the men, and led a successful attack. After occupying Vienna, Napoleon ordered his army to cross the Danube in pursuit of the Austrians. Marshals Lannes and Massena led the way across improvised bridges, supported by Marshal Berthier's cavalry. It was soon clear that Napoleon had miscalculated, and that they faced not just an Austrian rearguard, but the full might of Archduke Charles's army.
With their backs at the river, much like Napoleon had the advantage of in a previous battle.
Massena held the village of Aspern, while Lannes organized the defense of Essling. But desperately needed reinforcements and ammunition were held up, as the Austrians floated obstacles downriver to smash the fragile bridges. Lannes' old rival, Marshal Berthier, was placed under his temporary command. Lannes sent repeated orders for him to charge the enemy, in language that verged on an accusation of cowardice, and that evening the two marshals nearly came to blows. The next day, Lannes' corps led an attack on the Austrian centre, but was driven back by the weight of enemy fire. The French-held villages were under constant, pulverizing bombardment. Around 4 p.m, Lannes' old friend, General Pouzet, was hit by a cannonball and killed in front of him. Lannes, badly shaken, walked off to sit alone for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, we talk often about the stress involved in war for any soldier, but you not only have the weight of command being a marshal, But you also lose guys that you care about, and not only losing the soldiers under you, but your peers and your staff officers and your subordinates. Difficult stuff.
A cannonball skipped along the ground and smashed both his legs. Lannes was carried to the rear and placed in the care of the Grande Armée's most famous surgeon, Baron Larrey. Larrey quickly decided that he must amputate one leg. The operation went well, but the wound became infected, and Lannes died 9 days later.
Classic example of how just something as simple that we take for granted today as antibiotics would have saved a guy's life like this. How many times in history have men survived horrible wounds and then died in the recovery because of infection, something that couldn't be defeated at that time? That's why by the time you get to World War I, World War I is the first real major war where the majority, the significant majority of deaths are actually from battle wounds and not from disease.
Napoleon, who had visited Lannes every day, wept at news of his death. What a loss for France.
And for me.
And for me. Then he wrote to Lannes' wife, "The Marshal has died this morning of the wounds he received on the field of honor. My pain equals yours. I lost the most distinguished general in my army and a companion in arms for 16 years, whom I considered my best friend."
High praise. High praise. I have to say this about Lannes. I didn't hear about any major mistakes as they were describing his victories. Now, I wonder if the fact that he dies before things get really ugly in Spain, before Russia, before the German campaign, before Napoleon's downfall, how much, as we've talked about with other historical figures, does him dying at the height of his glory play into how highly he's ranked? But I didn't hear any major missteps in his career.
Marshal Lannes' death was a great blow to Napoleon and the army. He had proved himself an outstanding commander, as brave as Ney, with the military mind of Soult, the marshal who led Napoleon's vanguard in 4 of his greatest campaigns.
Says a lot.
His remarkable soldiering skills would be sorely missed by the emperor.
So much of how a battle turns out is because of how things begin and your early successes, and this guy's at the forefront of those early successes in these battles.
In the challenging years that lay ahead.
So,
1.
Davout.
Marshal Davout.
Must be something special to top the 2 guys we just talked about, because they were pretty substantial. Davout was one of the purest glories of France. That is a fascinating way to describe it.
Louis-Nicolas Davout was born into a noble family from Burgundy, with a tradition of military service that went back to the Crusades. At 15, he was sent to the military school in Paris, just missing a young Napoleon Bonaparte.
One of the only marshals who went to the military school in Paris. So few of these guys had this formal military education.
Graduated a few weeks before. In 1788, Davout was commissioned into the Royal Champagne Cavalry Regiment. But within a year, his vocal support for the French Revolution had got him into deep trouble. He was forced to resign his commission and spent 6 weeks in prison. In 1791, Davout joined a local volunteer battalion and was elected its deputy commander. The next year, France was at war with Austria and Prussia, and Davout soon proved himself a brave, highly organized and energetic officer. He also won praise for attempting to prevent his commanding officer, General Dumouriez, defecting to the Austrians, though he was not successful. The incident did speed Davout's promotion to brigadier general.
We talk all the time about this. Part of it is your ability, but part of it is always the opportunities and sometimes a little bit of luck. Being in the right place at the right time. Having these places where you come to power at the right time, you side with the right people, This guy's got minor nobility in his background. He's got that military education, but then he gets these opportunities. And he finds himself in a situation where he gets to be one of the people who prevents something like a defection of an army commander. And that fast-tracks him.
But the revolution was now entering its most extreme phase. A new law barred ex-aristocrats from the army, and Davout had to resign his commission once more. A year passed before he was reinstated, with command of a cavalry brigade in the army of the Moselle.
So, we don't want these particular class of people to be in our army, but oh man, now we're in this major pickle, and we need all the help we can get. Okay, you know what, never mind, you can go back.
He led a series of daring operations against the Austrians, winning particular praise from General Desaix, who became a close friend. In 1798, Desaix introduced Davout to his friend, General Bonaparte. Napoleon was not at first impressed. Davout was aloof, untidy and awkward. Napoleon even described him as a damn brute. But he did trust Desaix's judgment, and gave Davout a command in his army bound for Egypt. It was a tough campaign for Davout, who caught dysentery in Cairo. But he further demonstrated his military skill, winning a series of skirmishes on Desaix's expedition into Upper Egypt, and later leading a successful assault on the town of Abu Qir. Soon after their return to France, General Desaix was killed at the Battle of Marengo, robbing Davout of a close friend and patron. However, Napoleon had been won over by Davout's performance in Egypt. He now promoted him General of Division and appointed him Inspector General of Cavalry. Napoleon also encouraged Davout to marry Amy Leclerc, Pauline Bonaparte's sister-in-law, bringing Davout within the First Consul's extended family. It proved a loving marriage and a great source of strength to Davout in the years ahead. In 1803, Davout was given command of the camp of Bruges, where troops were preparing for the invasion of England. Here he established his reputation as an exceptional administrator and hard taskmaster.
And just as an aside, I haven't been to Bruges. I've been in a lot of places in Belgium, but I hear wonderful things. I hear it's a beautiful city. A lot of people have told me you definitely need to check out Bruges. What do you guys think? Let me know, because I'm going to be back in Belgium in January and looking for things to do.
Enforcing discipline and regular training, while paying attention to his soldiers' welfare and sacking officers who didn't meet his high standards. In 1804, Napoleon proclaimed a new French empire, and Davout, aged 34, became the youngest of its new marshals. His inclusion was a surprise to many, especially as he'd still not commanded anything larger than a brigade in battle. It's very likely that the deaths of Davout's patron, Desaix, and brother-in-law, Leclerc, cleared a path for him.
Yeah, see, Haiti, that was you see that happened 1802, right? We've talked about this and talking about American history. This debacle of Napoleon trying to retake Haiti after the slave revolt leads directly into Napoleon's decision to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States, because he realizes he's got his hands full in Europe and he can't be trying to deal with territory overseas that he just doesn't have the manpower or the ability or the finances to hold on to.
The next year, Davout's troops became 3rd Corps of the Grande Armée and marched east to take on the 3rd Coalition. On the eve of the Battle of Austerlitz, Davout force-marched his corps 70 miles in 2 days, arriving at dawn on Napoleon's right flank.
That is a massive undertaking in 2 days, and then going into battle, especially a huge, important battle like Austerlitz.
His troops went straight into action,
Jeez.
holding off a powerful coalition attack, buying time for Napoleon's decisive move against the enemy centre. It was a remarkable performance by 3rd Corps, soon eclipsed by an even greater feat of arms the next year in the war against Prussia. As Napoleon concentrated his forces at Jena to attack what he believed was the main Prussian army, he ordered Davout's 3rd Corps and Bernadotte's 1st Corps to cut off their retreat. But 10 miles north of Napoleon, near Auerstedt, Davout ran straight into the main Prussian army. With no sign of support from Marshal Bernadotte's 1st Corps, Davout's 26,000 men faced odds of more than 2 to 1. Davout's masterful handling of his troops enabled 3rd Corps to repel the Prussian onslaught. Then, his line stabilised, Davout went on the offensive and routed the enemy army.
You're outnumbered more than 2 to 1. You're in an independent command, thinking that you're attacking a small force or that you're cutting off a retreating enemy. Instead, you face this massive force, and not only do you hold off against more than 2 to 1 odds, but then you go on the attack. I get it. I get why this guy's praised so highly.
It was a stunning victory, won at a high price.
Gosh.
1 in 4 of Davout's men were either killed or wounded. When Napoleon heard the first report, he was incredulous. "Your marshal must have been seeing double," he told his aide-de-camp, making a joke of Davout's spectacle wearing. When the report was confirmed, he sent a message back to Davout. "Tell the marshal that he, his generals and his troops have gained everlasting claims on my gratitude."
Say this about Napoleon, for all of his kind of hubris and how highly he thought of himself at times, he also was not above lavishing praise when it was deserved on his men.
He later gave 3rd Corps the honour of being the first troops to enter Berlin. The next year, at Eylau, Davout's corps again played a pivotal role, trying to turn the Russian flank. When his men were driven back, Davout rallied them, shouting, "The cowards will die in Siberia, the brave will die on the field of honour." This time, 3rd Corps could not break through, but its tenacity helped persuade the Russians to retreat that night. Following the peace treaty of Tilsit, Davout became Governor-General of the new Duchy of Warsaw, where he oversaw the recruitment and training of Polish troops.
And this is a position, again, of trust, because you are right on the border with Russia, which for now you're not dealing with, but you probably are going to have to at some point. And you're kind of out on the frontier, so to speak, of Napoleon's empire.
In 1808, he was ennobled as Duke of Auerstedt. But for all his military prowess, Davout was not a popular figure. Notoriously tough, his troops respected rather than loved him, while several marshals were irritated by his air of superiority and blunt manner. In 1809, with war looming with Austria, Davout rejoined 3rd Corps at Regensburg. When Archduke Charles advanced into Bavaria, the army's temporary commander, Marshal Berthier, nearly left Davout to be cut off. As soon as Napoleon arrived, he ordered Davout to withdraw. It was almost too late, but with immense skill, Davout and 3rd Corps were able to fight their way clear and rejoin the army.
Sometimes the greatest display of skill that a general can have is in how he is able to extricate himself from an impossible situation.
Davout played a major part in the counter-offensive that followed, known as the 4-Day Campaign, pinning Austrian forces at Egmul, until Napoleon arrived to deliver the decisive blow. A month later, at the Battle of Aspern, Davout and 3rd Corps never made it across the river. The Marshal's role was limited to trying to sort out the crisis at the bridges until the French were forced to withdraw. When the army crossed the Danube again 6 weeks later, Davout was in his usual post on the right wing.
Often considered the place of honor to be on the right.
On the first day of the Battle of Wagram, the Emperor criticized Davout for his slow attack. But the Iron Marshal, as he was now known, was saving his men for what he knew lay ahead. The next day, Davout's troops fought off a major Austrian dawn assault, then launched their own attack, gradually driving in the enemy left flank, helping to make Austrian retreat inevitable. Davout and his corps had emerged from another major campaign as heroes. The grateful Napoleon bestowed on him a new title, Prince of Egmont. For a few years there was peace in Central Europe. Davout spent most of it in Hamburg, in his new role as Governor-General of the Hanseatic cities, cracking down on corruption and illegal trade with Britain. In 1812, Napoleon entrusted him with the enormous task of organizing the Grande Armée for the invasion of Russia. Davout's First Corps alone was 72,000 strong, as big as Napoleon's entire army at Austerlitz. When it crossed the Niemen River in June, its troops were so well turned out that one observer compared them to the Imperial Guard itself.
And it's such a tragedy then that they're headed for disaster.
Davout's giant corps was the spear tip of Napoleon's invasion. He mauled Bagration's Second Army at Saltanovka, but could not prevent its escape. 3 weeks later, his troops were in the thick of the fighting at Smolensk. But Davout's lack of allies among the other marshals began to show. Many were keen to see him taken down a peg or two, including Napoleon's Chief of Staff, Marshal Berthier, and perhaps even the Emperor himself. When Davout got into a row with Marshal Murat, whom he regarded as incompetent, Napoleon decided in Murat's favour, giving him one of Davout's divisions.
Davout had a massive army, though. I mean, a corps, but it was really an army.
Eve of the Battle of Borodino, the Emperor dismissed Davout's request to outflank the Russian defences. "You are always for turning the enemy," he told him. "It is too dangerous a movement." In the bloody battle that followed, Davout's corps led the frontal attack on the Flèche earthworks. The Marshal himself was injured when his dying horse rolled over him, but remained on the field directing the attack, which was ultimately successful.
Yeah, not many of these marshals we've talked about had a prominent role at Borodino.
6 weeks later, the Grande Armée began its infamous retreat from Moscow. The remains of Davout's corps was ordered to form the rearguard, but he was criticized for moving too slowly. Near Vyazma, a gap opened up, and Russian General Miloradovich pounced. First Corps was routed and saved only by the quick intervention of Marshal Ney, Eugène, and Poniatowski. Ney's corps took over as rearguard, but when he became cut off at Krasny, Davout was widely blamed for not turning back to rescue him, even though it would have been suicidal. The moment highlighted the gulf in charisma between a marshal like Ney, who was loved by the troops, and Davout, who was not.
You know, I mean, I think that could be overrated, though. There's a lot of different ways to inspire your men. Competence, tough love can be a way of inspiring your men, but victory is really the best way. And if you're a good soldier, I mean, a guy like Ney, he's loved by the men, but he had big highs and some pretty nasty lows as well. I think in American history of a guy like George B. McClellan, loved by his men, but a terrible field commander. Being loved by your men is not always a recipe for success.
Davout began the 1813 campaign holding Dresden, but when Hamburg was raided by Russian Cossacks, Napoleon sent him north to organize the city's defense. Exactly why Napoleon kept his best marshal in Hamburg while a decisive campaign raged in Saxony continues to puzzle historians.
That said, remember that Hamburg is the home base for the role that he has in being the Governor General of the Hanseatic cities. And so it probably was just natural that he be the one sent to deal with that because he was familiar with that place.
Davout was a stern and effective governor of Hamburg, securing the lower Elbe River and Napoleon's strategic northern flank. He organized a new 13th Corps and, following Napoleon's defeat at Leipzig, withstood a 6-month siege. Davout only surrendered Hamburg in May 1814. after confirmation arrived of Napoleon's abdication. But what difference the Iron Marshal might have made at Bautzen, Dennewitz, Leipzig or Long remains a tantalizing what if. Davout was not welcomed into the restored Bourbon regime like other marshals. His loyalty to Napoleon was despised by the ultra-royalists. Instead, he was forced into retirement and put under police surveillance. When Napoleon returned to France in 1815, Davout and Lefebvre were the only marshals waiting to greet him at the Tuileries Palace. But once again, Napoleon gave Davout a role which, in hindsight, seems a disastrous waste of his ability. Davout was made Minister of War and Governor of Paris. Vital roles requiring a brilliant and loyal administrator.
I get it though. Napoleon's marching out, and he's got to have, who can he trust? So many of the men who have been with him are not with him anymore. He needs somebody whose loyalty is absolute in this situation. He's one of the only marshals that comes out to support Napoleon right off the bat. Napoleon wants to keep guys like Ney, who were kind of, closer to him, where he can keep an eye on him. Davout is a guy he can trust.
And Davout worked miracles to raise a new army for Napoleon's final campaign. But if Davout, not Grouchy, had commanded the Emperor's right wing in 1815, who knows what might have been.
And if Davout hadn't been left in Paris, maybe there's bigger issues in Paris.
Following the Emperor's defeat at Waterloo, Davout organized the defense of Paris and urged Napoleon to fight on. Later accepting that he must abdicate, Davout ensured Napoleon's safe passage to the coast and submitted to the Bourbons.
This is a guy who certainly is more loyal than most to his emperor.
The royalists had promised Davout that his officers would not be prosecuted for their conduct. He was furious to discover these assurances would not be honored. He also testified on behalf of Marshal Ney, but could not save him from a firing squad. Davout was stripped of his rank and income, though they were restored 2 years later, thanks to the intercession of Marshal MacDonald. Davout shunned court, as he always had. His health was failing, and in 1821, the death of his eldest daughter left him grief-stricken.
It's also the year that Napoleon died, 1821.
He died 2 years later of tuberculosis, aged 53. Davout, the youngest and least proven of Napoleon's marshals, proved the most capable of all. Cool under fire and a brilliant tactician, he was the ideal corps commander in battle. A superb administrator, he was a stern and loyal deputy for the Emperor in Poland and Germany. His main weakness was his severe and blunt manner, which won few friends and left some even wishing to see him fail. Not something they saw from the Iron Marshal very often.
All right, so let's go ahead and bring up the whole thing here on screen. So I'm torn. I can see any one of these three guys that we talked about today being number one, especially Lannes. And I wonder if Lannes had not been killed in 1809, would he have been number one? If he would have been there to fight in Russia and in Germany in 1813 and in the defense of France in 1814, would that have been enough to put him number one? What do you think about these three and where you would put them in the rank of all of it? I can see the arguments for any of them, but I enjoyed this series, learned a lot. I'm actually really interested now to go back and rewatch the series on the Napoleonic Wars that we've previously looked at. Just to kind of now notice these guys a little more and how they all play into all of this. But it's been pretty fascinating. I hope you've enjoyed it. And as we wrap up, I just want to thank Jared in Rathdrum, Idaho, and Henri in Nantes in France. I think that might be the first time we've mentioned someone from France. Certainly in this series it is. So thank you both so much for your support on Patreon. See you again soon. Thanks for watching.